I sold my house on a Thursday, signed the papers, handed over the keys, and stood on the porch one last time watching a stranger carry boxes through my front door. My neighbor from across the street waved from her driveway. I waved back and told myself I was doing the right thing. My son had said so. My son had promised. Let me go back 3 months to the phone call that started all of this. It was a Sunday in late September, the kind of morning where the light comes through the kitchen window at just the right angle and makes everything golden and still. I was on my second cup of coffee, reading a library book I'd already renewed twice, when my phone buzzed on the counter. It was my son. I want to be honest about what that meant to me. He called on holidays. He called on my birthday, usually in the evening, usually for less than 10 minutes. Outside of those occasions, I heard from him when something needed handling. A form that required my signature. A question about his father's old insurance policy. Once, memorably, to ask if I still had his high school baseball trophies, because his wife wanted to display them in their new living room. So when I saw his name on that Sunday morning, I set down my coffee and took a breath before answering. "Mom," he said, "do you have a few minutes? I want to talk to you about something." I said, "Of course." I always say, "of course." He told me he'd been thinking. He and his wife, Renee, they'd been talking, and they felt bad about how little they'd seen me since his father passed. 3 years had gone by. I was alone in a 4-bedroom house in Tucson, rattling around in rooms that used to hold a family, and they were in Portland with a spare bedroom that sat empty most of the year. "We want you to come live with us, Mom," he said. "Not for a visit. Permanently. We want you closer. The kids want their grandmother around. Renee's on board. We've already talked about it." I didn't speak for a long moment. "Mom, you still there?" "I'm here," I said. I know it's a lot. But think about it. You wouldn't have to worry about the house anymore. The maintenance, the yard, the roof that needs work. You'd have your own room. We'd be there. It would be good for all of us. I thought about the roof. It did need work. I'd been putting it off because the quote I got in August was more than I wanted to deal with alone. I thought about the evenings, how quiet they'd gotten, how I sometimes left the television on just to have a voice in the room. I thought about my grandchildren, a boy of 9 and a girl of 6, who sent me drawings at Christmas and called me Grammy, and whose faces I knew mostly from photographs my son texted on their birthdays. I said yes. Looking back now, I understand that I made the decision in about 40 seconds, which is not nearly enough time to make a decision that size. But I was 68 years old, I had been widowed for 3 years, and my son had called on a Sunday morning and told me he wanted me close. You don't think clearly when you're that hungry to be needed. The weeks that followed were a blur of logistics. I hired a realtor, a brisk woman named Sandra, who wore blazers and spoke in percentages. The market was favorable, she said. We listed at $420,000. We had an offer within 9 days. I should have taken longer. I should have rented it out, kept it as a safety net, listened to my friend from church who said, "Bet, honey, don't burn your bridges." But I was already imagining Portland, rain and evergreens and Sunday dinners with my grandchildren, a life that had people in it again. I sold. I packed 40 years of a life into what fit in a moving truck, and what fit in a storage unit, and what fit in trash bags destined for Goodwill. I gave my neighbor my good casserole dish because she'd always admired it. I gave the library my husband's entire collection of Louis L'Amour novels. I pressed my hand against the wall of the bedroom where my children were born and said goodbye to a house that had held everything I loved. Then I drove to Portland. My son and Renee met me in the driveway. The grandchildren ran out and grabbed my hands and pulled me inside. The house smelled like something in the oven. There was a room made up for me, new curtains, a little lamp on the nightstand, a small vase of flowers. Renee said my granddaughter had picked out herself. It felt like a beginning. For a while it was. I settled into a rhythm. I helped the school pickups twice a week. I learned which cereal each grandchild preferred and what kind of lunch they wouldn't trade away. I cooked dinner on Tuesday nights, a standing arrangement that started because my son mentioned once that he loved my chicken and dumplings, and I held on to that comment like it was a contract. Renee was cordial. That's the word I keep coming back to. Not warm, not cold. Cordial. She thanked me when I did things. She kept the household schedule on a whiteboard in the kitchen and made it clear, kindly, but clearly, which parts of that schedule involved me and which parts didn't. I was a guest who had been upgraded to long-term. I felt the difference, even when no one said it out loud. My son worked long hours. He traveled twice a month for work, sometimes more. On the weeks he was gone, the house felt different. Smaller, somehow. Renee and I moved around each other carefully, like we were both trying not to take up too much space. I told myself this was normal. Adjustment. Any new living situation takes time. 8 months in, on a Wednesday evening in May, my son asked me to sit down at the kitchen table after dinner. Renee sat beside him. The grandchildren had been sent to watch a movie upstairs. I knew before he opened his mouth. I don't know how, but I knew. He said they had some news. He said the company had offered him a position in Denver, a significant promotion. They'd been going back and forth about it for a few weeks and had decided to accept. I said, "Oh, that's wonderful. When?" He said August. I said, "All right, I'll start looking into the move. How much time do we have to?" He stopped me there. He and Renee exchanged a look, the kind of look that had clearly been rehearsed. "Mom," he said, "the new place is smaller. It's a townhouse. We had to think about the school district. The price per square foot out there. Denver's expensive. The room situation is it's not going to work the same way." I looked at him. I looked at my hands. I said, "What are you telling me?" Renee spoke then. She said they'd done a lot of research. She said there were wonderful independent living communities in the Portland area. Very nice ones. Active lifestyles, social events, people my own age. She said they wanted to help me find something before they left, to make sure I was settled before the move. I want to be careful about how I describe the next few minutes, because I'm not entirely sure I was present for them in any real way. I remember nodding. I remember my son saying something about this not being how they'd hoped things would go. I remember Renee mentioning a specific community in the Beaverton area, as if she'd had the name ready. I remember excusing myself to use the bathroom and sitting on the closed toilet lid for a long time, looking at the tile. I had sold my house. I had given away my casserole dish. I had pressed my hand against the wall of my bedroom and said goodbye. And now my son was sitting at his kitchen table, telling me that the room they'd made up with new curtains and my granddaughter's flowers wasn't actually mine. It had just been temporary. It had always just been temporary. I went back to the table and told them I needed some time to think. They said, of course. They said to take all the time I needed. My son reached across and squeezed my hand and said he was sorry, Mom. He really was. He said it in the voice he used when he meant something, and I think he did mean it, in the way that people mean things when the meaning doesn't actually change what they're going to do. I went to the room, and closed the door. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time. The lamp my granddaughter had helped choose was on, casting a warm circle of light on the nightstand. Outside, I could hear the television upstairs, muffled voices and cartoon music. I thought about the Beaverton community Renee had mentioned. I thought about what it would mean to let them deposit me there, like something being returned. I thought about my storage unit across town, full of the furniture that hadn't fit, the boxes I hadn't unpacked because I'd thought I'd have time, we'd have space, things would expand to accommodate me. I thought about my daughter, my younger child, Claudia, and I had always had a more complicated relationship than my son and I did. She was stubborn in the way I was stubborn, which made us better at fighting than forgiving. When she moved to Asheville 6 years ago to run a small pottery studio with her partner, Gil, I thought it was impractical, and I didn't hide that well enough. We'd been cordial since then. We texted. We called on birthdays. Nothing like what I'd wanted, but nothing broken either. I had not told her I was moving to Portland. I'd meant to. The timing never felt right. I picked up my phone. She answered on the third ring. In the background, I could hear the faint sound of music, something low and instrumental. "Mom," she said. "Hey, is everything okay?" You don't usually call on weeknights. I opened my mouth to say something measured, something that sounded like I had a handle on things. Instead, I said, I sold the house and moved to your brother's, and now they're moving to Denver and they want to put me in a retirement community, and I don't know what to do. Silence. Then, what? I told her everything. All of it. From the phone call in September to the kitchen table conversation 3 hours ago. I told her about the casserole dish and the Louis L'Amour novels and the wall of the bedroom where she was born. I told her about 8 months of Tuesday dinners and school pickups and moving around Renee's whiteboard schedule and never quite feeling like I was in a home rather than staying in one. I heard her breathing change. I heard what might have been a door closing. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Mom, why didn't you call me before you sold the house? Because your brother asked first, I said. And I thought, I know what you thought, she said. She didn't sound angry. She sounded tired in the way people sound when they've been waiting for something to arrive, and it finally has. She said, I need you to listen to me, okay? Can you just listen? I said yes. She said, I have a guest house. It's not big. It's basically a converted garage with a bathroom and a little kitchen and a wood stove. Gil and I use it for storage right now. But the bones are good, and we've been meaning to clear it out for 2 years and just haven't. I want you to come here, to Asheville. I want you to stay in the guest house while we fix it up properly. And then I want you to actually live there, in a real way, not as a guest. As my mother, living next door to me. I pressed my hand over my mouth. She said, I know we've had our differences. I know I'm not always easy. But you're my mother, and you just told me that your son put you in a room for 8 months so he could check off a box, and now he's going to Denver. That's not okay. That is not okay. And I need you to stop making yourself smaller to fit into spaces that were never actually built for you. I was crying by then. I wasn't trying to hide it. Claudia, I said, just say yes, Mom. You can apologize for the pottery studio thing when you get here. I laughed through the tears. A real laugh, the surprised kind. Yes, I said, okay, yes. I want to tell you about the week that followed, because it mattered. I did not say anything to my son or Renee that night. I went to sleep in the room with the new curtains, and in the morning I got up and I made a plan. Not an emotional plan, not a plan built from anger or hurt. A practical plan, the way I used to make plans when there were things that simply needed handling. First, I called my attorney. I have a simple will. My husband's estate was settled years ago, but I'd never updated the beneficiaries on 2 of my financial accounts since moving. My son was listed as primary on both. I asked to have those accounts restructured, with Claudia added and the proportions adjusted. My attorney, a steady woman who had known me for 15 years, asked if I was sure. I said yes. She said she'd have the paperwork ready by Friday. Second, I called the financial institution where I kept the bulk of my savings. When I moved to Portland, my son had become a co-signer on one of my accounts, a practical arrangement we'd set up for emergencies. I had that changed. Politely. With paperwork, without drama. Third, I called Claudia back and said I'd be driving down in 10 days. Then I went about my remaining time in that house calmly. I made Tuesday dinner. I did the school pickup. I helped my granddaughter with the book report on frogs and sat with my grandson while he tried to explain a video game I did not understand at all, but listened to with complete attention because he wanted me to. On my last morning, I made a full breakfast. Eggs, toast, fresh orange juice. My son came downstairs in his work clothes and stopped in the doorway when he saw the table set. I didn't tell them until they were both seated. I said I had made a decision. I said I was going to Asheville to stay with Claudia, and I was leaving on Saturday. I said I was grateful for the 8 months, and I meant that, genuinely, because I had been close to my grandchildren in a way I hadn't been before, and that mattered. My son started to say something about Asheville being far, about whether I'd really thought this through. I told him I had thought it through more carefully than some other decisions I'd made recently. Renee looked at her coffee cup. The drive from Portland to Asheville is long, 2,000 miles and change. I'd planned it over 4 days, with stops in Medford and then Sacramento and then Flagstaff. I'd booked the hotels months earlier. No, that's not right. I booked them the morning after Claudia's call, before I'd even had breakfast. I drove out of Portland on a Saturday morning with my car packed, my storage unit arrangements sorted, and the kind of quiet in my chest that comes not from peace exactly, but from having finally stopped waiting for something. I want to tell you about Flag's death. I got there on the third evening, later than I'd planned because I'd taken a wrong turn outside Danlop and added 40 minutes. I was tired and my back hurt, and the hotel I'd booked was fine but not lovely, and I sat in the parking lot for a few minutes before going in, just to gather myself. I called Claudia to tell her where I was. She said, "Mom, I need to tell you something. Gil and I have been at the guest house all week. We cleared out every box, repainted the walls. It's this color called warm linen. It's really nice. We found a good second-hand armchair at the estate sale down the road. We put up curtains, real ones, not the ones that were already there. We want it to be ready when you arrive." I said, "You didn't have to do all that." She said, "Yes, we did. Now go get some sleep. You've got a long drive tomorrow." I want to say something about that moment, sitting in a parking lot in Flagstaff with a stiff back and a gas station coffee going cold in the cup holder. It was not a grand moment. There was nothing cinematic about it, but something in me that had been very tightly held for a long time just let go, a little. Enough. Claudia was clearing out boxes. Claudia was painting walls, warm linen. Claudia, with whom I had argued about pottery and practicality and stubbornness, was putting up curtains in a converted garage so that her mother would have a place that was actually hers. I sat in that parking lot and I let myself feel it. Not gratitude exactly. Something older than that. Something that felt like being recognized. Asheville is not what I expected, which I realize now is because I had never actually let myself imagine it. I had only ever thought of it as the place my daughter had gone without enough of my blessing, the place that meant she was far away and doing something I didn't understand. What it actually is this: mountains and morning fog and streets full of color and a pottery studio that smells like clay and wood smoke. A town that has room for people like my daughter, which means it has room for people who know exactly what they want and don't apologize for it. I arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. Claudia and Gil were both in the studio when I pulled up. She came out still wearing her work apron, hands gray with clay, and put her arms around me in a hug that surprised me with how hard it held. The guest house was small. She hadn't exaggerated about that, but the walls were warm linen. And the armchair was good, and the curtains were exactly right. There was a small kitchen with a 2-burner stove and a window above the sink that looked out onto the garden Claudia kept, full of things I didn't yet know the names of but would learn. I sat in the armchair that evening while Claudia sat on the floor with a cup of tea, the way she used to sit in my kitchen when she was a teenager, and we talked for 3 hours. About her father. About the years when we weren't as close as we should have been. About the pottery thing, which I apologized for, properly, and she waved off in the way that meant she'd already forgiven it, but appreciated the gesture. She asked me if I was angry at my son. I thought about it honestly. I said I was sad. I said I thought he loved me, but had never learned how to hold that love and his own life in the same hands at once. I said I thought Renee was a good woman in a situation that asked her to be diplomat and daughter-in-law at the same time. And that was too much to ask of anyone. I said I thought the children would grow up fine, and that I hoped I'd still be part of their lives even from a distance because I'd love those school pickups, even on the hard days. Claudia listened to all of it. When I was done, she said, "You know, you're more generous than I would be." I said I'd had longer to practice. That made her laugh. She had her father's laugh. I'd forgotten that. The months that have passed since then have been the quietest of my life, in the way that quiet can be a thing you choose, rather than a thing that falls on you. I walk in the mornings on a trail near the studio that winds up into the tree line and comes back around past a creek. I have started, improbably, to learn the names of wildflowers. My neighbor 2 houses down, a retired school teacher who grows tomatoes aggressively and shares them whether you want them or not, has become the kind of friend I didn't know I still had room for. Gil taught me to center clay on a wheel, which I was spectacularly bad at, but which made Claudia laugh so hard she had to leave the room. I take that as a success. I got a letter from my son in November. He said they were settled in Denver. He said the kids missed Grammy. He said he hoped I was doing well. and that he thought about our conversation a lot and felt badly about how things had unfolded. He did not say he was wrong, but he said he felt badly, and I think that was the most honest thing he could offer right then, and I wrote back a short note that said I was well, and that I hoped they were too, and that the grandchildren should call when they wanted to. My grandson called 2 weeks later and talked for 20 minutes about a Lego set. It was one of the better 20 minutes I've had recently. I'm not going to tell you that I don't think about the house in Tucson. I do. I think about the light in the kitchen on Sunday mornings, and the garden I spent 15 years making what it was, and the wall in the bedroom where I left a handprint of goodbye. I think about the casserole dish. I even think about Sandra the realtor and her blazers, and how cheerful she was when the offer came in, and how I shook her hand and smiled and didn't yet know what I was really handing over, but I don't think about it the way I thought I would. Not with regret, exactly. More with the tenderness you have for a chapter that has fully ended and needed to. What I understand now, at 68 years old with clay occasionally still under my fingernails and Claudia's garden visible from my kitchen window, is this: the people who want you in their lives make room. Not eventually. Not when circumstances align. They make room when it matters, even when it's inconvenient, even when it costs them something. They paint walls. They put up curtains. They answer on the third ring on a Wednesday night when they can hear in your voice that something is broken. I spent 8 months being grateful for a room that was never really offered to me. I drove 2,000 miles because my daughter answered the phone and said, "Come." That is the difference. It doesn't need to be more complicated than that. If you are somewhere tonight where you are tolerated rather than wanted, if you are making yourself smaller because the space you're in was never actually sized for you, if you are waiting for someone to call who has had your number for years and finds better reasons than you to pick up the phone, I want you to hear me say this. You do not have to wait for the people who promise to show up. You are allowed to turn toward the ones who already have. I am 68 years old. I live in a converted garage in Asheville, North Carolina, and I am growing, improbably, into someone who knows a wildflower by sight and has clay on her hands and sits on the floor drinking tea with her daughter until 10 o'clock on a Tuesday night. It is the smallest life I have ever had. It is the most mine. Thank you for listening. And if any part of what I've said sounds like your life too, I hope you know that you are not alone. Not even close. I've been thinking a lot lately about the difference between a promise and an intention, because I don't think my son was lying when he called me that Sunday morning. I think he meant what he said, the way most people mean things when they say them. Fully. In that moment, before life gets complicated and square footage becomes a real concern and promotions come through from Denver. But meaning something and honoring it are two different things, and the distance between those two is where I spent 8 months of my life. What I understand now is that I played a part in all of it. I'm not saying that to be hard on myself. I'm saying it because it's true, and because I think the honest version of this story requires me to admit it. I sold my house in 40 seconds of emotional decision-making. I didn't ask hard questions. I didn't keep a safety net. I walked toward the thing I wanted so badly. To be needed, to be included, to not eat dinner alone on another Tuesday, and I didn't look at the ground in front of me carefully enough. That is the thing I had to sit with, and sitting with it wasn't comfortable, but it was necessary, because the only way I was going to stop making that same mistake was to understand exactly how I'd made it the first time. There's something about getting older that nobody warns you about, which is that your children become people you have to learn. Not the people you raised, not the children who needed you. Actual separate people with their own fears and their own limitations and their own lives that were built, for better or worse, without you at the center. My son is not a villain. He is a man who wanted to feel like a good son without doing the full work of being one. That's a human failure, not a monstrous one. Recognizing that cost me something, but it also freed me from a story where I was simply wronged, and he was simply wrong, and nothing more complicated than that was true. The truer story is this. I spent years directing my need for connection toward the child who felt most like a reflection of the life I understood. I overlooked my daughter because she had gone her own way, and I hadn't fully forgiven her for it. Claudia and I wasted years being stubborn in the same direction, which is the particular loneliness of people who are too much alike. And then one Wednesday night she answered the phone and said, "Come." And every wall I had built around that stubbornness just came down. That's not luck. That's what happens when two people finally stop letting their pride be louder than their love. What I want to say to you, if you are somewhere in the middle of a situation like mine, if you are waiting in a house or a room or a life that was never actually sized for you, is that the waiting itself is a choice. I know it doesn't feel that way. I know it feels like circumstances, like necessity, like there's no other option right now. But I made a choice every day. I stayed in that guest room making Tuesday dinner and telling myself things were fine. And I made a different choice when I called Claudia. Courage is not the big dramatic moment. It wasn't dramatic when I called her. I was crying in a bathroom. Courage was just picking up the phone when I was already in enough pain that I had nothing left to protect. The life I have now is smaller than the one I thought I wanted, and I would not trade a single square foot of it.